Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Idland, the National Policy Director for Business for America, and thank you for joining our webinar today, Party Rifts and Voter Shifts, Political Realignment in the Election and Beyond. Business for America is a national nonpartisan business membership organization that works with companies across the country on political reform and ways to strengthen and protect our constitutional democracy. We work with companies both on policy advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. and in a number of states, and also with companies helping them tackle the challenging issue of polarization that affects their workplaces and communities. We have three really remarkable speakers with us today. So first, we'll hear from Didi Kuo. Didi is an associate director for research at the Center on Democracy and Development at Stanford University. Her research interests include democratic process, political parties, and political reform, and she oversees the program on American democracy at the university. She's also the author of Clientelism, Capitalism, and Democracy and Rise of Programmatic Policies in the US and Britain, and is the author of a forthcoming book called The Great Retreat, which we're happy to know is coming out in the winter, and it'll be about political parties. John Opdyke is the founder and president of Open Primaries. John is an activist and strategist with 30 years of experience working in independent and reform politics, and he's one of the country's most visible and vocal advocates for electoral reform and political independence. He founded Open Primaries in 2009. Jackie Salit is the president of Independent Voting and is known as a political innovator and advocate for the rights of independent voters. She succeeded in building one of the nation's largest networks of independent leaders and activists. Jackie had, in 2012, wrote a book, which is a firsthand account of the growing influence of independent voters. And that book is called Independence Rising: Outsider Movements, Third Parties, and the Struggle for a Post-Partisan America. And we're very happy to have all three of them participating. Before we get into the panelists, I wanted to introduce Sarah Bonk, who's the founder of Business for America, to offer a bit more context.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you all for joining us today to talk about party rifts and voter shifts. And when we talk about political parties, independent voters, political reform, it's really easy to get bogged down in the details of the 2024 election and all the negative emotions that go along with that, right? Trump said this, Harris said that, what even is going on with RFK Jr. and Jill Stein? And that is really not what we want to have this conversation focus on today. So for the next 53 minutes or so, I want to invite you to join us in taking the 30,000-foot view of our politics today. Although sure, we're going to have some really salient examples from the current election and recent history, what we really want to focus on today is the big picture and the long-term trends. American politics seem to be changing in a really big way, and maybe today we can all learn a little about what direction we may be heading. So to frame the conversation, I've got three charts that can help us understand where we've been, where we are today, and where we may be going. Chart number one, what do we mean by political realignment? So I'm not sure when I first saw this chart. It was either when I was studying public policy in college or years later when I was studying data visualization. But basically what you're looking at here is a chronological diagram charting the evolution and interrelationship of American political parties from before the revolution, all the way over there on the left, to 1880. And although it's overwhelming at first glance, it's actually quite straightforward. Each political party is shown as a line, and the thickness of the line indicates its level of support at the time. The political party that controls the presidency is on top, and the other party or parties are below. And so you can see over time as the parties split and merge along with the historical events, those little call-outs that cause people to leave one party and join another or start a new one altogether. And the political terms are indicated above with those vertical lines and names. So it's really cool to watch as voters and parties splinter off now and then, but the basic configuration of Democrats and Republicans we see here in the late 1880s, the larger red and yellow lines, remain even today, despite some occasional third-party challenges over the decades. So when it comes to rifts and shifts in our current political climate, this chart gives us a much-needed dose of perspective. Now, although we've come to think of our two-party system as fixed, our history shows that the tensions shaping American political life can and do change the political parties. And just really quickly, in case it might be of interest to you, there is a modern version that goes back to 2010. And I love how you can really see in this one the stability of that two-party system, especially through most of the 20th century. Chart number 2 is the rise of independence. As Richard alluded to, more Americans now identify as independent than Democrat or Republican. This is the chart ending in 2023, where Richard alluded to showing 43%. But in June 2024, so not that long ago, Gallup's tracking, the same poll, showed independence as a majority of surveyed voters at 51% for the first time in the survey's history. But generally, we'd say those independents are falling between 40 to 50% of the electorate. So when it comes to these rifts and shifts, it's showing how voters are dissatisfied with the two major party and the need for those parties to adapt and appeal to those voters, and the opportunity for third parties and independent candidates to attract many of those voters instead. And this brings us to chart number 3, around the 2024 political reforms. This map comes from our friends that represent us. It color codes the 50 United States to show which states have political reform ballot measures this year that would help create more competitive elections and give voters more choices at the polls. The states in yellow will be voting on a variety of measures this year, including open primaries, ranked choice voting, nonpartisan districting, and some other measures, some of which we'll talk about today, as well as other measures that aim to reverse those earlier reforms, thereby giving voters fewer choices in the states shown in red. So when it comes to those rifts and shifts, this is a chart that can help us think about solutions to give voters more choices and make the political parties work harder to win our votes. Finally, because we're Business for America, let's not forget to talk about why these rifts and shifts matter to the business community. So we hope today's conversation will help you understand the diverse viewpoints of your employees and your customers better, help you choose appropriate messaging for your employee voter engagement efforts at your company. Consider these shifts when planning your policy advocacy, PAC spending, and other political action. And finally, help you prepare for the political change and the risk of instability to your company. So thank you once again to each of you for joining us. Big thanks to our speakers and everyone who helped promote this event. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Richard.
Great. Thank you, Bonk. Okay, let's turn to Dee and get a perspective on the role that political parties play in our current system and what we can expect in the future. So, Dee, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah and Richard, for having us. It's really interesting to be talking about political parties at this moment in our nation's history. And basically, the sort of TLDR on the comments I'm going to provide are that we live in an era where we think parties are really strong, and really the solution to stabilizing our democracy in the long term is to make them stronger. There's actually a lot of evidence, a sort of academic consensus that we're actually living in a time of party weakness. We'll dig down deeper into all of those things. So there's kind of a paradox today. We live in a time of really heightened polarization in which the parties seem very strong. They're really well financed. They're excellent at winning elections and running campaigns. They also, however, seem weak. People are very upset at the party's inability to select good candidates or to somehow manage political extremism, especially on the right. And in fact, some of these extremist factions have basically reworked the parties from the inside out, meaning the Republican Party today looks very different than the Republican Party of 2012, for example, when they conducted a GOP autopsy after Mitt Romney lost the presidential election. In an era of polarization, trust in parties is not only low, but it's also declining. I'm also going to make these remarks beyond the United States to think about why political parties are important to democracy. Now, in the United States, it's the case that as suffrage expanded, political parties were critical to establishing the institutions of representation and to connecting legislative politics to what it is people wanted on the ground. But this is not just our history. It is basically universal in an era of democratization that begins in the 18th century and goes all the way up till after the Cold War. The history of democracy is a history of political parties and party building. The reason this is worth mentioning is because a lot of reform efforts try to take away the role political parties play in democracy, and I think that's a huge mistake. Political parties are the critical intermediary organizations that connect social demands, which are very diffuse and diverse in the electorate, to actual representative claims. They make public policy based on the interests of voters. And in fact, historically, good partisanship, meaning people with a healthy political sort of alliance to a political party, fosters democratic practice and values. This is not just through the nitty-gritty of saying to a representative, I need the potholes fixed in my district, but it's also being able to say, I'm a partisan. I want people to come, be able to be involved in politics, recruiting candidates, deciding what the issues of the day should be. These are all a matter of internal party deliberation, and parties are themselves sites of democracy in a way that spills over to our broader democratic institutions. And finally, party organizations are important because they go beyond the whims and dictates of any individual leader. When you have personalistic parties, which you have in many kind of emerging or weak democracies, you just get vehicles of loyalty. And that is a recipe for corruption and, in fact, for authoritarianism. But party membership across European countries where you can actually have like card-carrying party membership has declined significantly in the post-war era and all the way up through the turn of the century. We also have indicators that people just don't like the parties. So yes, we can talk about independence in the United States. And in fact, I have a slide very similar to Sarah's in just a sec. But vote shares for the mainstream parties of the center right and center left are also in decline across the sort of advanced and longstanding democracies of North America and Western Europe. And this is a problem because votes are going to what are called challenger or extremist parties that are not committed to democratic values and often stand explicitly against the democratic institutions and the party establishment in order to win votes. Now, this is the same Gallup data that Sarah just showed, but I wanted to add that emerging political science research, especially by these scholars Samara Klar and Yana Krupnikov, in a book called Independent Politics, argue that, we traditionally thought of independents as leaners, i.e. hidden partisans, when really this new survey evidence of independence indicates that independents are more cynical about the party system and political parties in general, and they're less likely to participate in politics. So when they do participate, it's in efforts to either weaken the role of the mainstream parties or to make sure that there's space for an alternative party, when in our two-party system, it's very unlikely that third parties will win without more structural electoral reform. And as a result, those are often wasted votes or spoiled votes in our two-party system. Now, the implications for the realignment that Sarah referenced are pretty significant. There are, across the advanced democracies, one of the main realignments is around economics. In the 1990s, especially after the Cold War, both of the parties across the right and the left actually became very similar on economic issues. And it doesn't seem that way, given our really high-profile fights about things like the Affordable Care Act. But we actually have two parties that support free trade, support businesses, have signed on to any number of kind of deregulatory, like pro-market policies. And as we've seen sort of economic issues become less salient, which is what this graph shows, across 8 advanced democracies, cultural issues have become the new axis of political contestation. Now, cultural here means any number of things. And in fact, it can be very difficult to disentangle cultural and economic issues. But immigration, for example, or the idea of sort of who's in and who's out of the national identity, ideas over religion, ideas over identity itself, like LGBTQIA, rights for women and minorities have all become more salient. And the reason this is difficult for political parties is we think in terms of a traditional left-right spectrum based on economics, strong big state on the left, less, more markets on the right. And in an era in which the parties don't actually differ that much on economics, they must amplify their disagreement on these other kinds of issues. Another type of realignment we see is over education. So this graph shows that highly educated voters used to vote much more for conservative parties. Again, this is comparative data, meaning it includes the United States, but many other countries, whereas the left parties were the parties of the working class. As we've entered a kind of post-industrial era, we've seen very recently that education divide shift, where left-leaning parties now claim more voters who are highly educated members of the professional classes, and right parties are fighting for the votes of the working class. That's a pattern that has been very true in the United States, at least in the 21st century. Now, another change is to party organizations themselves. Parties are supposed to do a lot of different things in our democracies. And what we see increasingly is parties are very effective electoral organizations because it's weird. Everyone hates parties, and yet they keep winning elections. The reason is because they're really good at winning elections, but they have become far less effective as intermediaries. They're no longer membership groups, they're only affinity groups. We think of parties the way we might think of sports teams. And there are lots of political scientists who have written effectively about this, including Eitan Hirsch, who says that we are political hobbyists. We're sitting there like clicking our likes on social media, but not really participating in any meaningful way in local politics, for example. We also know parties have focused much more on fundraising, advertising, and campaigns rather than on things like, maintaining ties with voters between elections or trying to reach out to, new constituencies with promises of different kinds of policies. And we also have ample empirical evidence that parties are better at representing corporate and affluent interests more than working class interests. And we used to have a party system that mapped onto social class or economic class in a much more straightforward way than we do now. So this has led to what some scholars call a responsiveness crisis, where the parties seem to say that they're very different, but actually neither party is particularly responsive to what majorities of Americans often say that they want, whether that has to do with gun control or free trade or redistribution. And that is sort of the lay of the land of how we can think about political parties. And I'm really excited to hear from our other speakers.
Great. Didi, thank you for that overview. Let me pose a question that comes from one of our listeners. And by the way, if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A. So the question, Didi, is, the barriers and challenges the two parties put up and make it difficult for independents to compete in the process. Would those are those barriers really fostering competition? And what is the sort of the strategy of the two parties to sort of control the process and not allow independents and third parties to emerge?
I actually like to challenge the kind of implicit assumption of that question, which is that we have two parties because of what the parties are doing. It actually has to do with our underlying institutions. So all democracies have to figure out how to translate votes into seats. Most democracies, most other advanced democracies, look at the entire proportion of votes cast for the legislature and allocate seats proportionally based on how many votes the parties received. That's called proportional representation. We are one of the few, albeit a very large, democracy that does what's called first past the post plurality voting in single member districts, meaning you can only have one winner and the person with the most votes wins. We have like almost a century's worth of evidence that this system, like literally this institutional configuration, produces two parties. It's called Duverger's law, based on an analysis from a French political scientist in the 1950s. So it's the two parties certainly also put up barriers, like sore loser laws that say if you lose in a primary, you can't run in a general election. But this argument that we have a two-party duopoly because of party rules is not the case. If you go to any other democracy with our institutional configuration, you have two political parties that compete. And the math of it is just that it's hard for a third party to win. As I'm sure Jackie knows, Ross Perot won 19% of the popular vote in 1992 and not a single electoral college vote. In the United States, it's going to just be structurally hard for a third party to win unless we change the method by which we translate seats into votes. So before you sort of go after the Republican and Democratic Party for blocking competition, that's really not what's happening. It's an institutional issue.
Okay, good. Thank you. And with that, John, let me bring you into the conversation here, because when Didi talks about, changing the system by which people get elected, I know you've been spending a great deal of time on several new concepts of how voters get to decide, including open primaries. So maybe you could just start by explaining what is an open primary system, and that I think that would help frame the rest of the conversation for us.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here. An open primary is not a single policy. It's kind of more of a description of a broad approach. Right now, there are open primaries in Alaska, Nebraska, Washington, and California. And they have different versions of what it looks like, but let me give you the broad strokes. Most of us think of a primary as, oh, there's a Democratic primary, and then there's a Republican primary. And some states restrict participation of who can be involved. Other states are more open, but that the primary is the process by which voters select the nominee of that party, the Democratic primary and the Republican primary. What an open primary is, it scraps the whole party construct and says there's no longer party primaries, there's a public primary, a people's primary, in which the voters select which candidates go from the preliminaries to the final round. In California, in Washington, in Nebraska, voters select which 2 candidates go to the general election. In Alaska, they select which 4 candidates go to the general election. Other states are considering other models this year. There's 7 ballot referendums that will look at different permutations of this. But in general, what an open primary is a taking it's saying that the primaries are not going to be a partisan function. They're going to be a public function of winnowing down issues and candidates from the first round to the second round, as opposed to selecting a nominee for a party. And that's a big shift that has had profound implications on voter satisfaction, voter participation, legislative behavior. That one switch from partisan primary to public primary has a big impact on a lot of different metrics. And I'm happy to talk about those.
Yeah. So, John, if we go back to one of Dee Dee's points that political parties can be a contributor to stability within the political system. And then we also consider that in 2020, only 63% of the American public chose to vote in the presidential election. And that was at an all-time high, I believe, but still is lower than most other advanced industrial economies. How would open primaries encourage greater participation, or would they encourage greater participation by citizens who may be fed up with the more conventional set of choices they have?
I love talking about the stability question because it's such a conundrum and it's such a challenge. And I think Dee Dee is so right. And I'm not a political scientist. I don't have all the data and all the expertise in that realm. I know that as someone who's lived in America, that the 2-party system was profoundly stabilizing for our country, particularly post-World War II, and did all the things that Dee Dee's talking about, imperfectly, of course, but nonetheless, the parties, they served as a filtration system. Issues would emerge on the fringes, movements would emerge, and the parties played a role of bringing them into the mainstream and incorporating their demands into the mainstream of American life. That's incontestable. But here's the irony, or the challenge that we have right now, is I think, others might disagree, I think the 2-party system has morphed from being profoundly stabilizing to profoundly destabilizing. And the primaries are not the only cause of that, but they're a significant contributor. Because right now, what happens is that before we get to the general election, before we get to November, we have these partisan primary contests in which I don't like to use the word fringes. I agree with Dee Dee. The ideological landscape, it's just outdated. It doesn't describe America. I think a better description is dogmatists. There's left dogmatists and right dogmatists. They're people that are absolutely committed to a certain policy. That might be the teachers union saying we will under no circumstances allow for vouchers or charter schools. That might be the NRA saying under no circumstances are we going to allow for any giving on gun safety. We let the dogmatists, the most absolutely committed to no conversation, our way or the highway, we let them determine who the candidates are going to be in November, what issues are going to be talked about, and what issues become third rails. And that's why the partisan primary system creates an electoral situation in which the dogmatists, the most inflexible voices in America, control everything. And that is profoundly destabilizing because every single issue, I think, again, I'm not a political scientist, there is not a single issue that you can innovate on, you can make progress on that is not complex, that doesn't require bringing together different political voices and forces and ideologies and backgrounds and urban and rural, all the easy issues we've dealt with. And we now have a political system that incentivizes politicians to cater to the dogmatists, not to the vast majority of Americans who are much more comfortable with complexity.
Right. So as you look at the recent history, is there evidence to suggest that open primaries encourage more moderation, less extremism? And do the candidates that come out of open primary systems tend to be more, let's call it independent minded and less aligned with one political philosophy or another?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence. I mean, just this is happening right now, today. There is an effort being pushed by former President Trump and the MAGA forces to force the legislature in Nebraska to change their rules regarding how they apportion their electoral votes. Right now, they have a district by district. So they have, I think 4 or 5 congressional districts. And they give their electoral votes based on the results in that. And typically, there's one congressional district that tends to skew more Democratic. And they want to change that so it's winner take all. And there's a Republican legislator and a number of his colleagues, but this guy's taking point, who is standing up and saying, I'm not going along with that. I won't do that. I did a press conference yesterday in which he basically said, sorry, I'm not going with that. And that's going to kill this whole deal. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and say that there's a direct causal relationship between he gets elected in a nonpartisan open primary system and he's willing to buck his political party. But that kind of political courage, that kind of going up against your own party is virtually impossible when you allow the parties to control the primary system. We saw that with Republicans that impeached Trump. They're all gone. The only ones that remain are those that are from the nonpartisan primary systems because they can take their case to all the voters and not have to campaign to the dogmatists in their own party. Right. But I think I really want to make this point, Richard, because I don't think it's a linguistic one. I don't think that makes you a moderate. Being able to go up against your own party, being able to represent your voters doesn't make you a moderate. It just means you're willing to give expression to something other than the most dogmatic, no compromise, no interest in talking to the other side elements that are so present in both the Democratic and Republican parties right now. But I think about 90% of America is very comfortable with that level of give and take, of complexity, you know?
Okay. Yeah. So John, if we think of the key goal here to increase the functionality of government, give us a short primer on ranked choice voting and how that reform might encourage greater participation and better results for the political system and strengthening our democracy.
Well, I'm not an expert on ranked choice voting. I support the right of people to enact ranked choice voting and use it. I sometimes think it's oversold as kind of a cure-all. I think that for me, a bottom line is, hey, every American needs to be treated the same. Everyone needs equal voting rights. You need to be able to vote in every publicly funded election. And there's tens of millions of independent voters that are locked out of even being able to vote in primaries.
Right.
Forget about the fact that they're still partisan primaries. They don't even get to participate. For me, that's more of a baseline issue. I think that the ranked choice voting issue is being combined with open primaries in many states. And we're going to get some fascinating data this November because there's Idaho, there's Colorado, there's Montana, there is Alaska, which has enacted it in 2020 and it's now being repealed. We're going to get to see how the voters think about the combination of, hey, let's let all voters vote and let's get rid of party primaries. That's one issue. Combined with, hey, let's change how we vote. Let's not just vote for a single candidate. Let's rank our preferences. Again, I'm not an expert on ranked choice voting. I focus on the let all voters vote side of things, but ranked choice voting is certainly grabbing a lot of interest around the country.
Right. Okay, good. John, thank you. We'll get back to some of those points here in a moment, but let me bring Jackie into the conversation. And Jackie, based on your experience over a number of years, I wanted you to respond to the suggestion sometimes that independent voters are really a myth, and that these are people who are confused, maybe uncertain, or they really might just be Democrats or Republicans. So what would you say to that premise?
One of my favorite mishaps that has occurred in the academic history of trying to assess this very question was that one of the most important pace-setting books written on this topic was titled The Myth of the Independent Voter, and it came out in early February 1992.
Mm.
And then 20 million people voted for us. So, it's a little bit like, oh, up. Maybe we got a little bit ahead of the curve. Here, got to get out of the ivory tower and check in on what's happening with the American people.
Right.
Yeah, I have the privilege of serving as the co-director of the Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy at Arizona State University. And when we were first established 2 years ago, the leaner question, as it's sometimes referred to, was something that we wanted to take on very early on in our work. And we were very fortunate, Dee Dee, to have spent some time with Mo Fiorino at Stanford, who said to us, so glad you guys are doing this work, because the whole leaner issue and the presumption that that's true is one of the most under-researched and mischaracterized phenomena in the entirety of political science. And so, when someone like Mo Fiorino says that to you, you kind of have to take that pretty seriously, which we did. So some of the research that we've done, Richard, has shown that the myth of the independent voter actually is itself a myth. That independents, if you look, independents cast ballots very situationally and circumstantially based on what the paramount issues of the day are and who the candidates and who the offerings are that are being put before voters. If you just look at any given election, independents will tell you, many of them will, that they might lean in towards one philosophy or another philosophy or whatever. But if you actually look at the voting patterns of independents over time, you see that independents move back and forth in terms of political party allegiance. They also will sometimes move in and out of independent status, largely actually having to do with what the rules governing the primaries are in their state. If it's a closed primary state, as was mentioned earlier, in June, the Gallup survey found 51% of independents, of Americans identified as independents, and that number is now dropped to the low 40s. It kind of moves back and forth, roughly between 43 and now 51%, but that has to do with a whole variety of factors, largely having to do, with the rules and regulations that exist on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Fact of the matter is, and this is what I think it boils down to, is that when an American identifies themselves as an independent, they are making a statement of noncompliance with the political system. with the state of the political system. That's why those numbers have gone up. You know, when the Perot era was vibrant and alive, 35% of Americans identified themselves as independent. Today, it's, 15, 16 points higher. And if you drill down into various constituencies and communities, you see things like 55% of Gen Z voters identify themselves as independents. Almost half of Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans identify themselves as independents. 41% of Latinos identify themselves as independents. 33% of African Americans below the age of 30 identify as independents. So it's the identification, frankly, which is the important feature of this. Who you vote for in any particular cycle has to do with who you can vote for.
Right.
And all of that. So so I think it's an important time actually to explode that myth and to create perhaps a challenge to the dominant paradigm in political science, where if you say you're a Democrat, that's accepted at face value. If you say you're a Republican, that's accepted at face value. If you say you're an independent, there's a follow-up question.
Right. Okay. Good. And I have a follow-up question, which is about given the rules, the way they're constructed, and how difficult it is to get on all 50 states as a national candidate to run for president, or the challenges John pointed out with open primaries at the state level. What is the connection between an independent candidate who he or she may have national stature, but doesn't have a party to affiliate with? And is it, as Didi suggests, essential for political parties to be the intermediary here? Do we need a strong independent party in the United States to strengthen the system?
It's such an interesting question. There's talk now, and this has been going on, this particular conversation has been going on really since the Perot years, which essentially is a conversation along the lines of, since you raised the issue of the US presidency, could there be a national all-independence primary process, which is not governed by a political party, through which a consensus independent candidate for the presidency could emerge? So we actually played with this during the Perot years in the Reform Party. Then a very important reformer, a former financier, Peter Ackerman, established an experiment called Americans Elect in the 2010s, which looked to foster that kind of process. It ended up not going forward, but it's coming back around. And frankly, I think that there's at least a shot at the possibility that something like that could emerge for the 2028 presidential election. And there's a lot of reasons why that is true. But I think also, I very much agree with Didi's point that you can't simply place the dominance of the two parties and the two-party system on the doorstep of the two parties for the very reasons, Didi, that you pointed out in terms of first past the post voting and the Electoral College and all of that. But that said, there's so much that operates in and on American politics that precludes the legitimacy and the competitiveness of independent parties and independent candidates. I myself, I'm not an attorney, but I've been involved in all kinds of litigation having to do with challenging some of these barriers over the last 35 years with different plaintiffs of one kind or another. And in many of these cases, when we have lost, some of them we've won on constitutional or First Amendment grounds, and some of them we've lost. When we lose, almost invariably, the court says that it needs to offer deference to the two parties because the parties provide a level of unique stability to the United States of America. And so we have come up against that argument in the courts over and over and over again. But to go to John's point, it's now the case that the parties are producing instability, not stability. And so what do you do with that conundrum in light of the fact that there's so much about the structure and the culture of American political life that reinforces that dominance at a time when there's so much of an apparent need to be able to go beyond it?
Right. Jackie, someone has asked about the relationship between being a moderate and being an independent, and if you could maybe provide a little bit of detail on the ideological composition or spread of self-described independence. Is there any indication how people lean?
Sure. If you use the horizontal ideological framework or paradigm, you will find that independents span the entire spectrum. And if you're going to use the categories of liberal, moderate, conservative, if you apply that, generally speaking, it comes out about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. However, if you step outside of that framework, and for example, if you appeal to independence, because a lot, people will say, well, goodness gracious, how do you build an independent movement, given that independents are so incredibly diverse and they're independent? They don't agree on anything, and it's like herding cats and, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But if you bring forth the issues having to do with the structure and the culture and the engineering of the political process itself, independents are massively unified across the spectrum on the need for structural political reform. And, we've seen that just over and over and over again. We've seen it manifest in elections. This was a big issue in Mike Bloomberg's runs for mayor. He served as mayor 3 times. Independents were his margin of victory when he first won, and they were his margin of victory in massive terms for his 3rd term in New York. And he was an outspoken proponent of shifting New York, which is, one of the toughest, most partisan, machine-controlled cities in the country, shifting that to a nonpartisan system, which, we tried to do over 12 years and couldn't get it done because pretty much every elected official in town and the New York Times editorial board opposed the idea that you should not have to join a political party in order to be able to vote in an election.
Right.
Shocking as that seems.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I add one thing to that question, Richard?
Please.
Because it's
Yes,
a very
John.
rich one.
Please.
And Jackie's being a little modest here. One of the things that I find most fascinating about the kind of what are independents? Are they left, center, right? Jackie's right. They're roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But one of the things that Jackie and her research partner, Tom Riley at ASU, uncovered is that you might be a conservative independent, but your social media networks don't look like conservative Republican social networks. Conservative independents value having friends and online relationships from the center and the left. Same with liberal independents. They want people that are from the right and the middle talking to them. So it's not just where do you stand in a fixed ideological sense, it's what's your relationship to the other.
Mhm.
To other ideas. And what independents are saying is, hey, I might be conservative, I might be liberal, but don't rope me off. Don't cordon me into an echo chamber where I can't ever talk to people that disagree with me. And that's a fundamental cultural challenge to the way the Democrats and Republicans have set up American politics, which is pick a team, demonize the other side, and don't talk to them. And that's what politics is. And independents are saying, nope, don't want to do that.
Right. Okay, good. John, that's a good setup for a question I'd like all 3 of you to consider, which is what are the implications of the rise of independence the advent of these political reforms like open primaries and maybe the declining trust in the conventional parties, what's the implication to the business community, right? So as all of you know, Business for America works with the private sector. That's our constituency, and we engage them in policy work and educational work and look for structural changes that we think will increase competition within the political system, which will result in a more stable, functional, successful economy, and one in which polarization is reduced and civility is increased. So those are priorities for many businesses we work with. So open question to any of you. How do these trends, particularly, the rise of independence, is it a good thing for the business community, or will it be disruptive in some way that business people should be considering?
I can't
Dee
jump
Dee?
into the super high level comment, which
Yeah.
is kind of a dodge, but I would also, I kind of want to get away from the idea that we just have a polarization issue. We have one party that has been taken over by anti-democratic candidates, and they do not support the institutions of democracy. They say elections are fraudulent. They deny the results of a legitimate election. And that's not me being partisan. It is literally a playbook that many other democratically elected but illiberal leaders around the world have been using in the 21st century. I think it is very bad for the business community to suffer from an unstable democracy. There's just ample evidence of that in authoritarian nations and in democratic backsliding nations. So before we even get to the question of political reform, we need to have parties that agree with the democratic process, that they trust the institutions, they're not spreading misinformation about even just the institutions, setting aside all other types of misinformation. That said, I also want to say something promising, which is that in this era of not just polarization, but an anti-democratic sort of set of a faction, at least, of a party that has come to power, we have a lot of reform activism because people don't want this. People want to preserve our democracy. They want to strengthen it. All of American history is a story of reforming institutions in times of democratic crisis. We've done it successfully in the past. We may debate what is democracy or how should we best accomplish that. But the fact that there are a lot of ideas out there and people like Jackie and John working on this, that is the future of democracy becoming a place that is good for business.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. Jackie or John, comment on that?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on it. One is I think that perhaps it's helpful to acknowledge that it's surely true that there are elements of the business community that find themselves a little bit between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, if you're a business leader, there's many situations where you have to go to a legislature or you have to go to Congress. And so you have to engage with the Democratic and Republican hierarchy because that's who occupies those seats. On the other hand, you've got half the country who are saying they want something other than what those parties have to offer. And those people are not just voters, they're consumers, they're citizens, they're part of the American public. And so I think that, a business leader who is attuned to these circumstances has to be trying to figure out how to navigate all of that. That said, one of the things that we did recently at Arizona State University is we did a survey in the spring where we tried to look at this, and this was Arizona only. We tried to look at the issue of trust and trusted institutions, trying to get a gauge of how people felt about kind of the major institutions that affect people's lives. Trust in business leaders, and again, this was just in Arizona, was unbelievably low. Unbelievably low. The three lowest entities were business leaders, social media, and politicians. And so to me, what that suggests is that there's an opportunity for the business community to step out in front and to say, hey, we're going to take some responsibility for changing the nature of the political culture. We're going to become not just strong advocates for democracy in the abstract, but we're actually going to get behind some of these political reforms that reflect a forward direction for our country. And we're going to support and participate in bringing that about.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for making that point, which I think is very critical. John, if you reflect on Jackie's observation, you think of how open primary campaigns around the country are being supported. I'm in Colorado. I know that the former CEO of DaVita, Ken Theory, is the major proponent behind our ballot question on open primaries. What would you add to Jackie's request for the business community to engage out of self-interest, but also helping stabilize the broader system upon which they rely on to succeed?
Yeah, I think that, you know, what Jackie's laying out is starting to happen. I mean, you're seeing that in a number of states. That the local Arizona business community, which wouldn't write a single check back in 2016 for open primaries, have put up $7 million, and they're still giving, because they're like, this has gotten way out of hand. So we're seeing that all across the country, and that's a good thing. I think the thing I would add to it is that every good business person knows that you need to invest in good times and in bad in R&D, in preparing for what's next, not just playing the game and selling your product, which exists, but getting ready for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I think that it's great that business people are starting to step up and support some of these ballot referendums. There is so much more they could be doing in terms of investing in the R&D, the innovation, the conversations about the health of our democratic process, because that's America. And right now there's shockingly little investment in that level of things.
Could you give us an example of what that R&D investment might look like?
You know, it's supporting constituency building and conversations and conferences and research. And, you know, Jackie just set up a new center at ASU to provoke some of this. It's called the Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy. We want an independent and sustainable democracy. We need to be spending, I mean, look what the right wing does. They spend $1 billion a year on just the conversation about free markets and libertarianism and regulation and so forth. They're at every university. The reform movement, the democracy movement, you know, we're lucky to have a handful of people like Didi who are doing this work. The business community could be transformative in terms of creating, and it's not just academic, that's one part of it. It's a social engagement that goes beyond just passing this law or that law.
Right. Okay, good. And John, I'll just remind everyone that, you know, Business for America is part of that ecosystem. So those of you who are business leaders or, you know, in a company, if you're looking for a home within which to, you know, pursue some of this thinking and contribute to this evolution, you know, we'd be happy to chat with you, and you can find us at bfa.us.
And I'd be happy to chat with you too, because I got about $100 million worth of ideas.
Great, good. We'd be happy to entertain those $100 million of ideas, John. Well, we have just 2 minutes, but let me just quickly get end the conversation here. But Didi, I wanted to go back quickly to you, and having heard from John and Jackie about this idea of stability, and what what final thought do you have about the party system as, you know, how might we try to reform it in the short term to increase stability?
That's a really hard question, and I might punt on this one as well. I mean, I think that what I was really talking about are internally what parties can do to be more socially connected to communities and understand what it is people want, instead of being beholden to the dogmatists, as John was saying. And that also means, in terms of the independent parties that Jackie was talking about, also getting into communities. How could you build like a governing agenda based on all of these heterogeneous preferences? And that's what parties do well, is kind of negotiate among factions, not just letting factions kind of take over, and trying to create a compromise through deliberation. And but in terms of the reforms, I think that it's a really interesting time to use the states as laboratories and see reforms are working and having their intended effect, bringing people into the political fold who currently feel excluded from it.
Right, right. And Jackie, one quick question for you. I know this is a little unfair with a minute to go, but I know you recently were at a National Convention of Independence that took place in Colorado. And what short summary would you offer about the future of the independent voter movement in the United States?
It's growing, and the leadership of different elements, organizations, strategies, and so forth were actually, for the most part, in a room together for 2 days and survived. So I take that to be a good sign.
Good. And on that optimistic note, Dee Dee, John, and Jackie, thank you so much for your time today. Again, thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.